On a crisp, quiet morning in the secluded woods, James Porter believed he had finally found peace. The cabin, tucked away at the edge of the forest, was more than just timber and stone to him. It was the legacy of his late father, built with calloused hands and preserved with love. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the kind of fragrance that carried memories rather than just scents. Yet what James did not know was that this very morning, his sanctuary was about to be invaded. Not by nature, not by strangers wandering off a trail, but by someone far more disruptive, someone whose sense of entitlement outweighed reason itself. And with the crunch of tires on gravel, James's calm retreat turned into a battlefield. The silver SUV cut across the quiet like a blade. Its polished exterior caught the sunlight, gleaming too boldly for the rustic forest path. Dust billowed behind as it rolled to a stop right in front of the cabin steps. Out stepped a woman who carried herself with a strange authority, chin lifted high, her posture stiff, as if the woods themselves should have recognized her presence. This was Karen, a figure well known in the nearby suburban community. She wasn't here for a friendly visit. She was here to take. James had been splitting firewood by the side of the cabin, his father's old axe leaning against the stump, when Karen emerged from the vehicle. Without hesitation, she strode forward as though the cabin had always belonged to her. Her confident steps, the firm sway of her arms, and the look of judgment plastered on her face all carried the weight of someone accustomed to getting her way. The silence of the forest was broken by her declaration. She insisted the cabin had been designated for community use, that the Homeowners Association Board, on which she proudly served, had planned an upcoming event here. In her eyes, this cabin was not a personal retreat. It was community property, and she was here to claim it. James stood in disbelief. His family had owned this land for decades. His father's will, the signed deed, and the carefully kept tax receipts in his desk drawer were proof enough that no community board had a right to it. But Karen's confidence made the air heavy. She wasn't asking, she was asserting. Refusing to let her intimidation sway him, James firmly denied her claims. He explained the ownership, the inheritance, the history, but Karen was not listening. She scanned the cabin with possessive eyes, pointing out the porch, the clearing, even the fire pit as if she were taking inventory of her new acquisition. When James held his ground, she shifted her tactic. She threatened to escalate. If he did not comply, she would call the police and report him as a squatter. The audacity of it stung. To be called a trespasser on his own property felt like an insult not just to James, but to the memory of his father who had poured his life into this cabin. Still, James kept his composure. He disappeared into the cabin and returned with the deed, yellowed by age but still legally binding, along with years of tax receipts. He presented them with calm conviction. But Karen's reaction was not what one might expect when faced with undeniable proof. Instead of backing down, she smirked. She claimed the documents were outdated, that new agreements had made the cabin part of the community's shared resources. Her words were bold, but the vagueness in her explanation betrayed the truth. There were no such agreements. She was spinning a narrative on the spot, and her confidence was the thread she used to hold it together. What could have been resolved with a glance at a deed now teetered on the edge of chaos. Karen pulled out her phone and dialed. James realized she was not bluffing. Moments later, the distant sound of sirens began cutting through the forest's tranquility. His chest tightened, not out of guilt, but out of the cruel irony of being forced to defend what was already his. The patrol car finally arrived, red and blue lights reflecting off the pine trunks. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions neutral, their notepads ready. Karen rushed to them, her voice laced with urgency, painting James as an intruder who had seized community property. Her tone was persuasive, dripping with conviction. But James was prepared. He calmly laid his documents on the hood of the patrol car, explaining their significance. The officers inspected the papers, nodding slightly at the legitimacy they held. Still, procedure demanded balance. They listened to both sides, noting Karen's unwavering insistence and James's measured responses. Though the officers did not remove James, they also did not dismiss Karen. Instead, They suggested the matter be escalated to the HOA board, where clarity could be sought. Their neutrality left James uneasy. To him, the facts were clear. But to Karen, this was just the beginning of a larger game. As the SUV disappeared down the gravel road, Karen left with the smug assurance of someone who believed she had gained ground. James knew she would not let this go. The battle for his father's cabin had only just begun. And as he watched the trees sway gently in the evening wind, James felt the weight of what was coming. He had the truth on his side, but Karen had persistence, connections, and a reckless sense of authority. What was meant to be a place of solitude was now a contested ground. The fight for the cabin was no longer just about land or wood or history. It was about legacy, about standing firm against intimidation. And with every passing second, James realized he was stepping into a storm that would test not just his patience but his resilience. The forest around him grew quiet again, but it was not the peaceful silence of before. It was the stillness before another clash. James braced himself, because Karen wasn't finished. She was only just beginning. The following days unfolded like a slow-burning fuse. James tried to hold on to the quiet rhythm of the cabin, but the peace that once wrapped the woods felt fragile, constantly threatened by the memory of flashing lights and Karen's smug departure. He knew her absence was temporary. The way she had left, with a smile not of defeat but of confidence, told him that she was preparing her next move. His suspicions were confirmed sooner than he expected. A notice arrived, pinned brazenly to the cabin door with blue tape. It bore the letterhead of the Homeowners Association and carried the weight of official language. The words declared that a dispute over the cabin's ownership had been raised and that an emergency board meeting would be held to resolve the matter. Until then, both parties were instructed to refrain from using the property. James felt his jaw tighten as he read. The HOA, a body meant to manage suburban lawns and neighborhood fences, had extended its reach into his secluded retreat. It was absurd, yet the paper in his hand threatened to strip him of access to the very place his father had entrusted to him. The meeting was scheduled at the community center, a plain brick building at the edge of the neighborhood where Karen lived. Though James rarely visited the suburb, he made the drive, knowing that silence would mean surrender. As he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed Karen's silver SUV already parked at the front, angled as if to declare its dominance over the space. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and rows of folding chairs were filled with familiar faces, neighbors from the community, many of whom James barely knew. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, Karen among them, her posture upright, her expression composed like someone certain of victory. When the meeting was called to order, Karen wasted no time. She stood and presented her version of events, her voice polished, her words crafted to persuade. She painted the cabin as a property of shared community interest, suggesting it had been overlooked in past records but intended for neighborhood events. She spoke with the air of someone who believed repetition could make fiction sound like truth. James listened, his hands gripping the folder that contained his documents, the deed, his father's will, and years of tax receipts. When it was his turn, he stood slowly, the room falling quiet under the weight of his steady tone. He laid out the facts. The inheritance from his late father, the continuity of ownership, the taxes paid without fail. Each piece of evidence was placed like a stone, building an unshakable wall of truth. But even facts could not silence murmurs. Karen had allies in the room, neighbors she had charmed or pressured over the years. They whispered, nodding along as she interjected with claims that James's records were outdated or possibly contested. Though her words lacked proof, the influence she carried made the room tilt in her favor. The board deliberated, their voices hushed yet sharp, and when the decision came, it landed like a blow. Pending further investigation, neither James nor Karen would be allowed to use the cabin. The property was to remain closed until official clarification was obtained. James felt the weight of injustice press down on him. He had brought proof, yet his rights were suspended by the noise of doubt. Karen, meanwhile, smiled as if the ruling were her victory. Though she had not gained control of the cabin, she had achieved something equally potent. She had stripped James of access, turning his sanctuary into contested ground. Driving back through the winding roads to the forest, James carried more than frustration. He carried determination. The board's temporary injunction was not the end. If anything, it was a challenge to dig deeper, to prove beyond question that the cabin belonged to him. The days that followed saw James poring over files, making trips to the county clerk's office, and retrieving records older than himself. He obtained certified copies of property records, stamped and signed, affirming his sole ownership. Each page was a shield, each signature a weapon against the fog of Karen's deception. Yet even as James prepared, Karen maneuvered. She made appearances in the neighborhood, speaking to anyone who would listen, framing James as a selfish man clinging to a cabin meant for the community. Her words dripped with the charm of false concern, cloaking her intentions in the language of fairness. Slowly, she spun a narrative, one that threatened to overshadow truth with perception. Back at the cabin, the forest seemed to sense the tension. The wind carried a restless edge, branches scratching against windows at night like warnings. James double-checked locks, stored his documents carefully, and prepared for every possibility. He knew Karen was not finished. The injunction was only a pause in her campaign, not the end of it. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the clearing, James noticed something strange. A set of tire tracks cut across the gravel near the cabin, fresh and deep, yet he had not driven that day. The sight unsettled him. Someone had been here, and James didn't need to guess who. The fight had shifted from words and meetings to something more dangerous. The board's ruling might have bound his access on paper, but it hadn't stopped Karen's determination to stake her claim. James understood then that this battle was no longer confined to notices and discussions. It was spilling into the physical space of the cabin itself. And if Karen was bold enough to step onto the property despite the injunction, then the storm ahead would be harsher than he had imagined. As night fell and the woods grew dark, James sat at the old wooden table inside the cabin. The certified county records spread before him. They were the proof of his right, but proof meant little against someone willing to twist reality. The silence pressed in, heavy and uncertain. Somewhere out there, beyond the tree-line, James felt the lingering presence of his adversary. Karen's battle was not bound by fairness. It was fueled by entitlement. And as the cabin creaked in the cold night air, James realized the true test had not yet come. The shadows hinted at what was next. The intrusion was only beginning. The forest carried an unease that James could not shake. Days after the HOA's ruling, he lived in a state of alertness, listening for sounds that did not belong. The crunch of tires on gravel, the echo of a door creaking when it should have stayed shut, the rustle of footsteps outside. The cabin, once a place of peace, had grown into a fortress under siege. Each night he checked the locks twice, sometimes 3 times, as if repetition could secure him against what he feared was coming. Then, one morning, the silence was shattered. James returned from a short trip into town, the bed of his truck loaded with supplies and groceries, only to find the cabin door ajar. His chest tightened as he froze on the gravel, staring at the yawning darkness beyond the threshold. The doorframe bore splintered marks near the lock, jagged and raw. The intrusion he had dreaded had come to pass. He stepped inside cautiously, the air heavy with the smell of disturbed dust and faint with smoke. At first glance, nothing seemed stolen. The furniture, the bookshelves, the worn quilt folded neatly at the foot of the couch, all sat where they always had. But as James pushed further in, his stomach sank. His desk had been overturned, its drawers ripped out and scattered across the floor. Pages lay crumpled and torn, their edges blackened as if someone had attempted to burn them before abandoning the task. The carefully stored documents, the deed, the tax receipts, his father's handwritten notes, all had been ransacked. Some papers were shredded, others smeared with ink, and a few were missing altogether. James's knees nearly buckled as he bent to gather what scraps he could. His father's will, once folded with precision, was torn in half. Tax receipts that had survived years of safekeeping now bore water stains and rips. The certified county records he had collected only days before were strewn about like worthless confetti. Though some remained intact, the vandalism was deliberate, an act not of theft but of destruction. This was no random break-in. It was targeted. It was personal. And then, almost as if summoned by the weight of his realization, Karen appeared. Her silver SUV rolled up the gravel path, tires crunching with unsettling calm. She stepped out with feigned surprise etched across her face, her voice carrying tones of mock concern. She looked around at the broken lock, the scattered papers, and shook her head as though she were a bystander in an unfortunate accident. James said nothing, his silence louder than accusation. Her expression, though carefully composed, could not mask the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. She suggested that such chaos was proof that the cabin was unsafe in his care, a thinly veiled attempt to strengthen her narrative. She offered no acknowledgement of his anguish, no sympathy for the damage done. Instead, she lingered, circling the cabin like a hawk surveying prey, speaking in tones that dripped with false concern while her gaze betrayed ownership. James gathered the remaining documents, pressing them into a folder, his every motion slow and deliberate. He knew she wanted him rattled, disoriented, ready to slip, but instead he steadied himself. If Karen expected him to collapse under the weight of vandalism, she had underestimated the depth of his resolve. Still, when she finally drove away, leaving only dust and tension in her wake, James felt the enormity of what she had done. It was not just the cabin she had violated. It was the memory of his father, the history etched into those papers, the quiet trust of family legacy. She had tried to erase it, to make the proof fragile enough that lies could outweigh truth. That night, James did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, the salvaged documents spread before him, lit by the dim glow of a single lamp. His father's will, though torn, was still legible. The certified county records, though crumpled, still bore official seals. She had tried to weaken his case, but she had not succeeded in destroying it completely. Even so, James knew he needed more. Something stronger than papers stored in a desk drawer, something Karen could not reach. He resolved to return to the county office again, to obtain new certified copies, to secure duplicates of every record she had tried to destroy. But before he could make those plans a reality, the knock came. It was heavy, deliberate, the kind of knock that carried authority. When James opened the door, two uniformed officers stood in the fading light, their expressions stern. Once again, Karen had acted first. She had reported him, this time with claims of suspicious activity at the cabin, insinuating that James himself had staged the break-in to gain sympathy. The accusations stung like salt in an open wound. To be painted as the author of his own loss, to have his grief twisted into manipulation, was a cruelty only Karen could devise. But James, calm even in outrage, presented what remained of his documents. He explained the intrusion, the broken lock, the destroyed papers. The officers listened, their skepticism balanced with professionalism. They noted the scene, inspected the splintered doorframe, and photographed the overturned desk. Though they did not act against James, their neutrality once again cut deep. Karen's words hung in the air like a shadow, casting doubt even where truth stood clear. As the officers departed, promising further investigation, James stood at the threshold of his battered cabin, the night settling heavy around him. The forest, once alive with the gentle hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves, now seemed to whisper warnings. He understood the battle had escalated beyond arguments and meetings. Karen had crossed into destruction, into defamation, into tactics designed to break him down piece by piece. But if she thought the damage would drive him out, she was wrong. The cabin stood, scarred but upright, just as James did. And as he locked the broken door with a temporary latch, he vowed to fight not just for wood and stone, but for the truth that Karen could not erase no matter how much she tore, smeared, or twisted. In the silence of the night, James realized the next step was no longer just about defense. It was about striking back, with evidence stronger than lies, with resilience greater than intimidation. The war for the cabin was entering its most dangerous phase. The morning after the break-in, James rose with a clarity that cut through his fatigue. The cabin still bore scars of the intrusion, the cracked frame, the scattered papers, the lingering scent of dust and damp wood. But his mind no longer lingered on the destruction. Instead, it sharpened into resolve. Karen's tactics had proven ruthless, but she had made a mistake. By trying to erase his proof, she revealed her fear of it. And that was where James would strike. He gathered the remnants of his father's will and the damaged receipts, sliding them into a folder that felt heavier than it should. Though they were scarred, they remained fragments of truth. Still, James knew fragments were not enough. He needed records that were untouchable, records Karen could not smear with lies or rip apart in the dead of night. The drive to the county office felt longer than usual, the winding forest road stretching beneath his tires like a path between two worlds, the isolated cabin on one end, the machinery of law and authority on the other. The county building stood tall and impersonal, its stone facade weathered yet unyielding. Inside, the hum of printers and the shuffle of papers created a rhythm of bureaucracy that felt oddly reassuring. At the clerk's desk, James requested certified copies of every relevant record: his father's will, the deed, tax documents, and property maps. The clerk, efficient but curious, raised an eyebrow at the volume of paperwork James sought. He explained little, offering only the necessity of securing what already belonged to him. One by one, the clerk produced official copies, stamped and sealed, each page carrying the undeniable weight of legality. James held the stack with both hands, the embossed seals catching faint light from the ceiling. These documents were more than paper. They were armor. They were proof Karen could not dismantle, no matter how many stories she spun. Back at the cabin, he placed the records in a fireproof box, locking it tightly. For additional security, he made digital copies, storing them across multiple drives. He even considered renting a safe deposit box in town. If Karen's goal was to erase his claim, then redundancy was his shield. But even as James fortified his defense, Karen continued her offensive. In the neighborhood, she spread her version of the story with practiced ease. She told residents that James was a recluse clinging to a cabin meant for community joy, a man who hoarded resources that should belong to everyone. Her words painted him not as a rightful owner but as a selfish intruder. The whispers grew, carried by neighbors who trusted her confidence more than they trusted documents they had never seen. She wielded perception as a weapon, blurring truth with falsehood until the lines began to bend. Yet for all her effort, Karen's foundation was cracking. James sensed it. He noticed it in the way she avoided direct mention of ownership when others asked too many questions, deflecting with vague statements and sharp smiles. He saw it in her eyes when their paths crossed unexpectedly at the grocery store, the flicker of unease when she realized he carried himself not with defeat but with quiet determination. The tension escalated when another HOA notice arrived, this one announcing a follow-up meeting to reassess the dispute. Karen, it seemed, had convinced the board that James's case was weak, that his supposed evidence was insufficient. What she did not anticipate was the arsenal he now carried. The night before the meeting, James spread the certified records across the cabin's table. The stamped seals gleamed under lamplight, each one a shield against deception. His father's name, signed decades earlier on the original deed, stood like a ghostly witness, silent but powerful. The following evening, James returned to the community center. The air was thick with anticipation. Folding chairs scraped across the linoleum floor as neighbors settled in, their expressions curious, some skeptical, others sympathetic. Karen sat at the front once more, her confidence radiating like armor. She opened with poise, reiterating her narrative with the ease of someone who had repeated it too many times to count. She spoke of community, of fairness, of property meant for all. Her words drew nods from those who trusted charm over evidence. But when it was James's turn, he rose without haste, his folder clasped firmly in his hands. One by one, he placed the certified records on the table for the board to see. Each document was a stone laid with precision. The county-stamped deed, the tax receipts, the property maps, the certified copy of his father's will. His voice was calm, steady, the tone of a man who no longer fought against whispers but stood anchored in fact. The board examined the papers, their expressions shifting as the seals and signatures left little room for doubt. The murmurs in the audience grew quieter, uncertainty replacing Karen's carefully woven narrative. For the first time, her voice faltered when she interjected, claiming the documents must be outdated or improperly recorded. But the board members were not convinced. Though they did not deliver a final ruling that night, the tide had shifted. James had reclaimed ground, and Karen's confidence showed cracks under the weight of certified truth. She left the meeting more quickly than before, her silver SUV pulling away with sharper turns than usual, as though speed could erase the memory of her stumble. James, however, did not celebrate. He knew her too well by now. A woman like Karen would not yield gracefully. If she could not defeat him with persuasion or perception, she would escalate. And he had already seen the lengths she was willing to go. The vandalism, the false reports, the twisting of truth. Back at the cabin, he reinforced the locks, checked the windows, and placed the fireproof box in a hidden corner. The night was still, but the stillness no longer soothed him. It felt like the calm before something greater, a silence waiting to be broken. As he sat on the porch, the certified records safe behind him, James gazed into the dark woods and felt the weight of his father's legacy pressing against his chest. He had secured proof. He had strengthened his claim. But Karen was not gone. She was watching, waiting, preparing her next move. And when she struck again, James knew it would not be with words or papers. It would be with something harsher, more desperate. The battle was not finished. It was entering its most dangerous stage. The cabin stood as it always had, nestled among the trees with its weathered timbers and quiet strength. Yet to James it no longer felt the same. What had once been a sanctuary now felt like a fortress under siege. He had locked every door, secured every window, and stored his certified records with care, but the unease lingered. It was not fear of losing the property anymore. That battle, at least in paperwork, had been won. Instead, it was the knowledge that Karen was not finished. He had seen the look in her eyes after the last HOA meeting. It was the look of someone cornered, someone unwilling to admit defeat. For people like her, loss was not just about property. It was about control. And Karen was not the kind of person to surrender control without taking something in return. For several days, the woods around the cabin remained still. James kept to his routine, chopping wood, cleaning the debris left from the break-in, and tending to the place his father had cherished. The silence was unnerving, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, one evening, as dusk painted the treetops in deep orange and shadow, James noticed something out of place. The back door, which he had locked and reinforced, hung slightly ajar. A cold draft slipped through the gap. His heart sank as he approached, the creak of the hinges confirming what he already knew. Someone had been inside. The sight that met him inside froze him in place. His father's old desk, the one where James had carefully laid out the certified records just days before, was overturned. The drawers had been yanked out, their contents flung across the floor. The fireproof box was pried open, its lock bent and broken. While the certified documents remained intact, thanks to their resilience and duplicates stored elsewhere, everything else bore the mark of calculated destruction. The framed photographs of his father were smashed, glass shards scattered across the wooden floor. The tax receipts, though replaceable, were shredded into confetti-like strips. Even the old cabin ledgers his father had once kept, filled with notes about repairs and expenses, were ripped apart. This was not theft. This was punishment. Whoever had broken in wanted to send a message that James's determination would be met with ruin at every turn. He knew who it was, of course. There was no mystery in the act. Karen had finally crossed from manipulation into outright vandalism. And yet, she still played her part carefully. When she arrived later that week, pulling up in her polished SUV, her tone was feigned concern. She gasped at the sight of the destruction, her hand clutching her chest as if she were the one who had suffered loss. She muttered about how terrible it was, about how unfortunate incidents like this can happen when ownership is disputed. Her words carried the weight of implication, designed to seed doubt while deflecting suspicion. James said nothing. He did not need to. Her performance rang hollow, a play meant for an audience that wasn't there. But behind her feigned sympathy was the smirk she tried to hide, the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes when she saw how the cabin had been ravaged. It might have ended there, another bitter chapter in their battle, but fate intervened in a way neither of them expected. A few days later, James received a call from law enforcement. An anonymous tip had been filed, leading officers to investigate the vandalism at his cabin. They wanted to inspect the damage firsthand. When the officers arrived, they took careful notes, documenting every shattered frame and torn ledger. James provided them with the certified records, explaining how the vandalism was targeted at destroying his proof. The officers listened closely, their expressions hardening as the picture grew clear. But the moment that shifted everything came when they mentioned the tip. The caller, who had refused to give their name, claimed to have seen Karen's SUV parked near the cabin on the night of the break-in. The detail was too precise to ignore, and the officers promised to investigate further. For the first time, James felt the weight begin to lift. Justice, which had seemed so distant, was finally within reach. Karen, however, remained bold. Days later, she appeared at another HOA gathering, once again spinning her narrative. She claimed James's accusations were paranoid, that vandals and squatters often targeted unmonitored cabins. She painted herself as a victim of slander, a woman unfairly accused by a man too stubborn to share community resources. Some nodded, others looked uneasy. But the whispers of her SUV being spotted near the cabin had begun to circulate, and cracks in her facade widened. That night, James returned to the cabin with a heavy heart but steadier resolve. He repaired what he could, replaced broken locks with sturdier ones, and set small cameras near the entrances, silent witnesses that would not be so easily destroyed. For all her power in the HOA, Karen could not control evidence forever. And then it happened. Under the cover of darkness, movement stirred near the cabin. The faint glow of headlights slipped between the trees before being cut. A figure approached, familiar in posture and stride. The cameras caught it all, the forcing of a lock, the rummaging through drawers, the deliberate scattering of items. James stayed silent, hidden within the shadows of the cabin's second floor, heart pounding but mind steady. He no longer needed to confront her directly. The truth was recording itself in real time. When law enforcement returned days later, armed with both the anonymous tip and the footage, the confrontation was inevitable. Karen's carefully maintained mask began to crumble under the weight of undeniable evidence. What had been whispers and suspicion transformed into documented fact. James did not rejoice. He simply watched as the wheels of justice began to turn, knowing that the final chapter of their conflict was approaching. Karen's grip was slipping, and soon the cabin would no longer be a battleground but a home once more. But before peace could be restored, there would be one last storm to endure. The morning of Karen's reckoning began like any other, with mist weaving silently between the pines that surrounded James's cabin. Yet the air carried a heaviness, the stillness of a forest that seemed to know something was about to break. James rose early, not with dread this time, but with a sense of inevitability. The cameras had captured everything. The truth, which Karen had twisted for so long, was finally laid bare. When the officers arrived, their presence shattered the quiet. Their vehicles crunched against the gravel drive, lights flashing faintly against the trees. This time, they were not here to question James, nor to mediate an argument between neighbors. They were here with purpose, guided by evidence too clear to dismiss. Karen was already at the cabin when the officers pulled in. Her silver SUV angled with practiced boldness across the drive as though it belonged there. She stood near the porch, speaking animatedly into her phone, no doubt spinning another story for someone on the other end. But when the officers approached her, the shift in her expression was unmistakable. Surprise flickered first, then indignation, and finally something darker, recognition of the inevitable. The officers presented her with the footage. The recording, grainy yet undeniable, showed her frame moving through the cabin under the cover of night, rifling through drawers, scattering belongings with deliberate malice. Her SUV's license plate glimmered faintly in the background of the shot. There was no room for debate, no space for another performance of outrage. Karen protested, of course. She claimed the footage was doctored, that James had set her up, that she had only come to inspect damage as part of her duties with the HOA. But her words fell flat. The officers listened, but their eyes carried the weight of certainty. They knew what they were seeing, and her frantic justifications only deepened the cracks in her story. Then came the moment that no one expected. As the officers informed her she was under arrest for trespassing and vandalism, Karen's composure broke. The commanding tone that had once cowed neighbors and board members dissolved into desperation. She pleaded, bargaining with promises of influence and connections, her voice rising until it echoed unnaturally across the trees. But nothing could alter the truth now. Her authority, once unquestioned, had crumbled to dust in the face of evidence. James stood silently by the cabin's porch as the scene unfolded. He did not gloat. He did not smile. He simply watched, steady and still, as Karen was led to the waiting vehicle. The silver SUV that had once been a symbol of her intrusion now sat idle and powerless, a relic of battles lost. As the officers drove away, the forest seemed to exhale. The air grew lighter, the tension that had coiled around the cabin for weeks loosening at last. For the first time since the ordeal had begun, the cabin felt like home again. Not a battlefield, not a stage for conflict, but a place of quiet belonging. Yet the fallout extended beyond the cabin's walls. Word of Karen's arrest spread quickly through the community. The HOA, once under her iron grip, fractured in her absence. Board members who had followed her lead out of fear or convenience now distanced themselves, speaking in hushed tones about how far things had gone. Some expressed regret for not questioning her sooner. Others remained silent, wary of their own complicity. Meetings that had once been dominated by Karen's voice now became spaces of cautious reform. Neighbors began discussing ways to prevent abuses of power in the future, drafting new bylaws that emphasized transparency and fairness. For many, Karen's downfall was not just a scandal but a wake-up call, proof that unchecked authority could corrode even the simplest of communities. For James, the change was quieter but far more personal. The cabin, once scarred by vandalism, slowly began to heal. He replaced the broken locks with stronger ones, repaired the shattered frames, and restored the old desk to its rightful place by the window. New copies of his father's photographs filled the cabin again, their presence a reminder that legacy could withstand even the most determined attempts to erase it. In the evenings, James would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the wind shift through the trees. The silence no longer carried menace but peace. He thought often of his father, of the work he had put into the cabin, the long hours spent building and maintaining it, and the quiet pride he must have felt in leaving it behind. Defending the property had not just been about legal ownership. It had been about protecting that legacy from those who would exploit or destroy it. And in the end, the truth had prevailed. Not through shouting matches or intimidation, but through patience, persistence, and evidence. Documentation had been his shield, resilience his weapon, and justice his reward. The final closure came weeks later, when James received a notice from the county. The injunction placed during the dispute had been lifted, formally restoring his unrestricted ownership. The cabin was his again, legally and symbolically, with no shadows of doubt remaining. On the day the letter arrived, James drove to the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. He stood on the porch, letter in hand, and let the sunlight spill across the wood. The forest around him was alive with birdsong, the creek nearby bubbling softly as it always had. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, to let the weight fall away. The battle was over. The legacy endured. And the cabin, resilient as the man who defended it, stood ready to welcome the quiet peace of days to come.